All right, welcome back to the viral unit. Today we're going to talk about SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome. There are a couple of SARS. You know one, I'm sure, and that is SARS-2, which we'll talk about in a moment. But SARS-1 was the severe acute respiratory syndrome that first appeared in, I guess it was the late 1990s. We'll check on that as we go along. But it's very similar to what you know as COVID. Um, whoops. SARS-1 was caused by a brand new coronavirus. It's never been found in people before. And so at this time, it was found in China. And so everything kind of shut down as far as travel immediately. Here you can see it was found in the Foshan, Guangdong province in China. I'm sure I'm not saying that right. But its cause was a horseshoe bat, which was sold in what are called wet markets in China, like our coronavirus or COVID. It was respiratory transmitted, and it could create a huge pandemic and cause significant disease, just like SARS-2 did. So, as I mentioned, everything kind of got shut down as far as flights. There was kind of a great panic, if you will, when it first came out. Now, here's the horseshoe bat, lovely little creature. But it is eaten and sold in areas of China. Oops. So how did they shut this down so quickly? Well, first of all, they use the common methods of public health that have been in use forever, which is basically quarantine, isolate, and just provide distance, which is what we do with, or what we did with coronavirus or COVID. And oh, here it is in 2003. Uh, there was huge collaboration among everybody. And, I mentioned here scientists and laboratories, but governments as well worked very well together. When China first learned of this, they alerted the World Health Organization and other countries immediately. And so other countries put travel protocols into place. And then the final reason was they realized that living close to animals and in some of the way that markets were conducted in China and other areas of the world were very likely to affect human health. And so there was some shutdown of those markets in China, or at least some clearing of horseshoe bats, et cetera, from those markets. Excuse me. All right. So here is SARS-2, which is the one we know as COVID-19. Now, there's a difference. SARS-2 coronavirus is the name of the virus, okay? And COVID is the name of the disease. So oftentimes we use these interchangeably, like this is a COVID virus. Well, it isn't actually a COVID virus. It is the SARS-2 coronavirus that causes COVID. Okay, so just to clear that up. Now, if I do happen to mention, I'll try very hard not to say COVID, but just know that COVID is the disease state. All right, so SARS coronavirus 2 first emerged in Wuhan city in China. And again, it was possibly from direct contact from a horseshoe bat. It was first detected in the wet markets, and the wet markets are, they're open air markets where people sell live and slaughtered animals. And that's, obviously you're coming into contact with, live specimens. And so transmission is pretty easy. So in early January, so it was first detected in December, and in early January, scientists over there identified it, and they identified it as a coronavirus. They have found it in live animals, civet cats, foxes, minks, and raccoon dogs, which are all susceptible to this. So don't worry about that. This coronavirus in Wuhan wet markets. Oops. Okay, so here's a civet cat, a raccoon dog, Yeah, raccoon dog, fox, etc. So these are the animals that were in the Wuhan markets that were capable of transmitting the coronavirus. So here's an example of a wet market. Here's some animals that have been butchered. Over here, there may on the left-hand side, there may be animals in cages, or maybe inside the store, or maybe the store just sells slaughtered animals. But other market stalls in this area might be selling actual live animals. All right, so to date, we know of 2 SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome coronaviruses, coronavirus 1 or coronavirus 2. And obviously they're both coronaviruses, and coronaviruses also make up the common cold. So the common cold is made up of several different types of viruses, but coronaviruses make up about 20% of them. And the other types of viruses that make up colds are rhinoviruses, respiratory syncytial virus or RSV, and parainfluenza virus. There's some that are theorized that are caused by, those that are unknown. Scientists don't study typically every single cold virus because there are just so many of them. But they have identified certain ones as different species. Now, coronavirus naturally infects humans, bats, and other Asian mammals, as I mentioned just a few slides ago. They are enveloped viruses. So remember, if you look at the picture up here, that's the virus, and that's the virus, the coating on it. It has spike proteins, which are the blue and yellow spikes that are on top of the virus particle. Inside is their DNA or RNA. And in this case, coronaviruses have a single strand of RNA virus. Okay, so remember we talked about smallpox, and smallpox was a really big virus, and it had double-stranded DNA in it. And this one just has single-stranded RNA. Now, RNA stands for ribonucleic acid, and DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. You've probably heard of those. Ribonucleic acid in humans is typically found in the cell cytoplasm, in ribosomes, or other things, but primarily in ribosomes. So when a double-stranded DNA virus gets into our cells, it typically attacks our DNA. If an RNA virus gets in, it attacks our RNA. So it jumps in there and inserts its RNA into ours. So the coronavirus is called the coronavirus because it has these crown-like protein spikes. So corona kind of meaning sun. So here we have a sun. The virus is enveloped, and so only lipid molecules are able to get in. So how does this little bugger infect us? Well, as you already know, it enters through your nose, your mouth, or your eyes. And then the little spike proteins that are on it match up perfectly with some cells in our airway that produce a protein called ACE2. So you can see these, if you look at the gray area, then you can see those little ACE2 proteins that are sticking out. And there we have the coronavirus attaching directly onto one of those. So it's making use of something we already have to attach to itself. All right, so then what happens is the oily membrane of the coronavirus fuses with the human cell membrane. They're very similar. And then once it's fused, it can open up its contents when it is inside the human cell then. So if we look at this on the left, there we have you can see what's left of the spike proteins on the virus, and it's actually gotten the virus, the RNA has actually gotten inside the cell. We don't see it right here, but you can see it floating around a little bit, some little gray squiggly. Some of it didn't get exactly inside the cell, but some of it is in there. So the genome It has about 30,000 genetic letters, which are also called nucleotides, which is why we call it deoxyribonucleic acid. So nucleotides make up the genes. So humans have about 3 billion, more than 3 billion actually, but this little virus has about 37. And so what happens, it gets into our cell and it inserts itself, and we read it and we say, oh, we need to make some of this. It's telling us to make some proteins from this RNA. And so we go ahead and make these proteins, which are copies of the virus. Okay, because we're just looking at it thinking, oh, this is something we need to do. But it's actually the virus that has gotten inside and is kind of taking over that mechanism, telling us to make more of its viral particles rather than making more of the cell's necessary proteins and nucleotides. So now that it's in the cell machinery starts to churn out new spikes and other proteins, as well as copies of the single-stranded RNA. Okay, so that's our cell that's just churning out a bunch of them. Then our cells assemble those protein spikes and the nucleic acid, the RNA, and make a nice little packaged up virus. The virus then fuses with our cell membrane, and then it moves to the outside of the host cell membrane and is released. And that way we can infect a lot more people, or we can infect more of ourselves. Those particles can then, virus particles can then attach to other areas of our airway, etc. Okay, so each cell that gets infected releases millions of copies of the virus before that cell dies. So that human cell just is cranking out virus. It's like, the instructions are build as much of me as you can. And so it keeps building and building. And then finally the cell does die because it's not making anything for itself. And so then those viruses can infect nearby cells, as I mentioned, like in your lung or your pharyngeal cells, your mouth cells, etc., or they can end up in droplets that go on to infect other people. So the mechanism of infection for COVID or coronavirus causing COVID, in severe cases, the immune system overreacts to this process, to these invaders, and it starts attacking its own lung cells, trying to get rid of this virus. Normal response is to try and get rid of anything that's there. But in certain cases, the lungs get attacked as well. It's just a very, very strong immune response. So then the lungs become obstructed with a lot of fluid and with dying cells and with viral particles, and you start to have difficulty breathing. And so in some cases, these infections can lead to acute respiratory distress syndrome and possibly death. And that's where you see people going into the hospital. They're having difficulty breathing. They put them on a ventilator to breathe for them, trying to get the lungs repaired, or allowing your body to repair your lungs and to clear the virus. Occasionally that does work, not always though. As you've seen, there have been a number of deaths, and that's because the lungs have been damaged so far. They're so far gone that, the human can't really recover from that. So coughing and sneezing obviously are going to, spread out those droplets onto people and any surfaces that are around. The virus can remain infectious for hours to several days. So if you go into your grocery store and you're coughing and you cough onto the big display of oranges there, the next person who comes along and picks up that orange and takes it outside to eat it for their lunch and peels it, well, they're going to put a little bit of that virus into their mouth. So the CDC has recommended, as you know, that people diagnosed with COVID wear masks to reduce the spread of infection. And healthcare workers obviously should wear masks too. So remember about antibodies and antigens. Here are antibodies that are now attaching to the viral spike protein. So they are going to work trying to get rid of that virus. Now, another thing that's important is do you remember I said it had an oily coating and that oily membrane was able to fuse to our membrane? Well, soap is the only, well, not the only, but is the primary way of getting rid of the virus because the water shunning tail, so there's a soap has molecules and they have lipid, uh, lipid areas or and non-lipid areas. And so the soap particles insert themselves into the lipid membrane to pry it apart. So not only is soap you wash your hands and the soap is helping to clear it off of your skin, but it's also actually helping to destroy the virus itself. So the best way to get infected, to not get infected, is to wash your hands with soap. I know a lot of people use alcohol, and I do as well, and that does kill viruses. But soap is actually the very best thing to use for those two reasons. It helps to kill the virus, and it gets rid of the virus from surfaces. Okay, so there are a lot of variants. So because it is an RNA virus, it can make lots of different variants of itself. It mutates very, very easily. So here are some of the variants that have been found. You don't need to know all the differences between them. Alpha obviously was the original one, and then the variants have continued on. I don't have all of them. We're up to Omicron right now, and that's the Omicron BA.5. But you can see how easily this, I mean, the virus has been around, let's see, almost 3 years now. So it has really changed. All right, so here are variants of concern. In May of 2020, the B.1.1.7 showed up in the United Kingdom, and it was very highly transmissible. So that one got a lot of people sick in Britain and some in the United States. Then the next one came from South Africa, and that doesn't mean there was a new virus. That just means the virus mutated. Now, how does a virus mutate? Well, oftentimes the way it mutates is it takes a little chunk of your RNA and accidentally inserts it. Remember, your cells are building these, so it might just mistakenly take a small little chunk of something, a couple of little nucleotides, and insert it in, and then that changes the property of it. Or you can have a different virus that you're infected with, and it takes a little chunk of that different virus and inserts it into its own genome, and then it's a variant. Or it can actually change, just by accident, our cell is assembling it, and it is, it puts two parts of the same virus together, like two alpha viruses, they don't quite make it exactly right. So anyway, that's how all these variants come about. All right, so the third one, the P1 gamma, came about in Brazil. In India was the next one, and then the B Omicron came out, and it spreads very easily, and that's what's circulating now. The BA.5 is circulating. So you know all of this, I'm sure, but infected people are contagious even if they are asymptomatic. As a matter of fact, sometimes some scientists think that is the most infectious stage, just before you start showing symptoms. And that's what the next one is. And also early in your illness, when you first get the symptoms, then you're likely to be pretty infectious then too. Now, those with severe disease, obviously, they're having a harder time clearing the virus from their system. So they're going to have more virus, and they're going to have it for longer. So transmission, you know this as well, close contact with someone who has COVID. If they sneeze or cough, or, they even speak to you loudly or close to you, those droplets can get right into your nose, your face, your eyes, your mouth, etc. Droplets can actually spread about 6 feet or 2 meters, and you can breathe in those infected droplets. Now, they will eventually sink, but the particle size is very, very small. So they do hang around in the air for a while. And here you can see, and they can stick around minutes to hours. And interestingly enough, I'm sure I have this, those gator type masks that some people wear. It's like it's around their neck and it's like an elastic sleeve or something, and they pull it up. That actually increases infection. And it's the same with bandanas. And the reason is because those actually reduce the particle size that's coming out of your mouth. And so it stays in the air longer and and therefore can infect more people for longer. So risk areas are obviously areas that have poor airflow, like in the middle of winter in any enclosed building. Um, Also, if you touch your eyes, your nose, your mouth after touching a doorknob, a telephone, your mailbox, whatever, and someone has touched it recently who has the coronavirus, that's another easy way of getting infection. It stays on surfaces hours to days, but the risk is fairly low. Like I said, if someone had just coughed on those oranges and you go right outside and eat it, then yeah, of course you're likely to get infected. But that isn't always the case. If you go into, let's just say, a restaurant, and someone in there has it and they're 10 feet away, it's less likely that you'll get it. Now, if the waiter or the waitresses has it and they're putting your silverware down, then that's another story. All right, so symptoms. Symptoms typically appear 2 to 14 days after exposure, with the most common time being between 4 and 5 days. Symptoms, as you know, are fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath, and eventually some people have difficulty breathing. Of course, you're going to be tired, you have muscle aches, headaches. Some people do lose their sense of taste or smell, and sometimes that's the first symptom. Sore throat is typically the first symptom, and then you can have congestion, runny nose, nausea, vomiting. The current BA variant is a little more cold-like than the alpha one was, that had severe fever and chills. That does still happen sometimes, but like I said, it is a little more cold-like, the one that's circulating now. So what are the dangerous symptoms? Well, obviously trouble breathing. Anytime you're starting to gasp for air, that's an emergency. And if you do have coronavirus and you're just getting up to go to the bathroom and you're having a little, it's just harder to breathe, then that's also an emergency, and you should go into the doctor, because that means that your lungs are becoming filled with some fluid, and you need to be checked and probably put on some oxygen, if not a ventilator. Also, if a person has dementia, then that's not new confusion. But if suddenly, your mom, your boyfriend, your sister, they start, acting like they're confused. Where are they? What's going on? That's a very dangerous symptom. And of course, the inability to wake someone up, or for them to be able to stay awake, at any time. Those are both emergencies. And then pale blue or gray skin, nails, lips, nail beds, etc. That means they are hypoxic, meaning not getting enough air, and another emergency trip to the ED is required. So, as I mentioned, this is corona. The top picture is coronavirus, and the bottom picture is COVID. Coronavirus is the actual virus, and COVID is the disease. Some people have gotten COVID toes, which is a unique phenomenon that is not well understood yet. But what they are swollen and discolored toes, either reddish or turning a little bit blue or purplish. And early research says there's no connection between coronavirus and the skin problem, yet there are many who report having COVID toes. So, as the research goes along, we may find that there is a connection, maybe we won't. So how do we diagnose it? Well, there are lots of rapid tests. The government gave some out. You can buy them in your local CVS or Walgreens. And those are antigen tests. So basically, they're looking for the antigen. So remember, the antigen is what is infecting you. The antibody is what your body's doing to help it. So the antigen is, we're actually looking for the virus right there. But now when you have coronavirus and you're doing a swab, there's a lot of mucus, there's also skin cells and other things. So depending on the quality of the specimen depends on if you're going to get an accurate result or not. There are a lot of false negatives in these. And the other thing is that they're not very sensitive. So you need a good amount of antigen to create a positive. So now the next test, which is more the gold standard, is the nucleic acid amplification test. So sorry. And this is abbreviated NAAT, but it's also abbreviated PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. And basically, that makes you take a sample, and we're able to make 1 billion copies of that viral RNA if it is in there. Okay, and so then we can detect small amounts of that because we've made a bunch of it out of what is there, and if nothing's there, then obviously there's going to be no copies of this made. Okay, so another type of test is looking for antibodies. And so that we check your blood and we look to see if you have made any antibodies to respond to an infection of SARS-CoV-2. And again, these can have some false negatives at the beginning, especially because your antibody response, if you recall, takes a few days to kind of get going. So the PCR, or the NAAT test, is actually the most accurate. Okay. So antibody tests, we don't currently use those, but because they are not as accurate and they take a while. All right, so you remember the original SARS, when they didn't know what it was, they were freaked out, and I mean, kind of the world, scientists, whatever. And so they immediately shut down a lot of stuff. Well, with this virus, they tried, but they didn't try quite hard enough. If you recall, we started seeing news reports out of China that there was, some clusters of cases. There wasn't really anything known about it. The scientists in China were working very hard on it, but they didn't really alert, quote, the world for another week or so, and for their own reasons, and who knows why. But that did have the net effect of allowing it to spread a little more, and so then it became epidemic worldwide. And the only way to attack that is to do all of the things that we did, maybe do them a little better. Like if we had shut down a little bit sooner, then it's likely that it wouldn't have spread quite so much across the United States. But again, there are a lot of political reasons, and different people have varying opinions about vaccines and quarantining and all of that. So, it is a little bit difficult to convince everyone. But anyway, lots of companies went right to work on making vaccines. Once it was identified as an RNA virus, then scientists knew they could produce a new type of virus to prevent it. So Pfizer and Moderna are the two that are preferred. Those have shown the best results, meaning the most likely to provide protection and the highest degree of protection. Johnson and Johnson, they have another virus vaccine, excuse me, and it is useful. It's just not quite as effective as the Pfizer or the Moderna. So these viruses, you remember how we talked about other viruses, different types of viruses. Well, this one contains genetic material that gives our cells instructions on how to make a harmless viral protein. Okay, so our cells say, we get the vaccine and it says, make this coronavirus virus protein, okay? And so we actually go ahead and make an antibody to that. And then when we actually encounter the real thing, we already have memory to it. So it's similar to in the old days, like with smallpox, how they actually put the real virus in you, but some people died from that. So, obviously we don't want to do that if we can help it. So this actually is a vaccine that tells our cells, make this, it's harmless. And so we make a little bit of that, and then our antibody response gets, really amped up. And so then if we do actually see the real stuff, then we can kill it quickly. Okay. Johnson & Johnson just is it's a modified version of a different virus, but it has some particles of the coronavirus in it. And so because, you see those coronavirus particles, you are able to make a response. But it's just not quite as effective as the other one. All right. So what are some other ways of prevention, that are I guess you could say medications. So Evusheld is a long-acting antibody treatment. So you can protect someone before their exposure, or you can give it to someone who you know is going to be exposed. So this is often reserved for people who do not have a strong immune response. Let's say someone is in the hospital with cancer or leukemia, and obviously coronavirus is spreading through the hospital at the peak of the epidemic. So you might give this to those patients to prevent them from actually getting serious COVID. Okay. It's not for anyone who has tested positive because it's too late at that point, and not for anyone who has been recently exposed. So once you do have it, there are a couple of antiviral treatments that are available. The first one reduces the amount of virus in your body, and that's a pill. You have to take it within 5 days after the symptoms appear. Okay, so if you've had it for a week and a half, this isn't going to work. But the drug is Paxlovid, and it inhibits the protein. So it stops the replication. And then there's another one in the Paxlovid, which is ritonavir, and that slows down, it slows down the body breaking down the first drug. So that okay, let me just tell you this. The pill, it just prevents the virus from making proteins. And so it slows down the replication, and then you're able to conquer it on your own. You can also get it via infusion or IV, and that's within 7 days after symptoms appear. So if you've gotten sick, and after 5 days, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't hardly breathe, I'm going to the hospital, then they can oftentimes give you this, which will help to prevent the really serious side effects of the COVID. Okay. Monoclonal antibodies. These also are for people who are at high risk for developing serious symptoms of COVID. You have to give these also within the first 7 days. And what these are is they have people who have gotten coronavirus and have recovered. They will go and they will donate blood. And then I won't go into how this is done, but they can harvest from that blood the antibodies against coronavirus. So then they make them into real concentrate, and then they can inject those into people so that they have an immune response before their own. They're getting antibodies from someone else. All right, so let's talk about the prevalence of coronavirus. This was an epidemic, and it's still ongoing, although it's not nearly at the levels that we saw in late 2019, 2019 and early 2020. So this slide I had for my last class, and in June 26, 2022 was when I taught this particular lecture. There were a total number of cases of 543 million, total deaths of little over 6 million, and approximately 11 million vaccines given. As of October 31st, so that's the day I'm recording this, total cases were over 630 million. So obviously another 100 million have gotten the disease in this, I guess it's 4 months. Yeah, 4 months, another 100 million people. Total deaths has risen, but not as much. Omicron is not quite as serious of an infection, or doesn't cause quite the same level of symptoms as the original alpha version. And now we have administered another, 12 billion vaccines. Excuse me, I said 11 million back there, but 12 billion vaccines. So an extra billion over what we had done in June of 26. So that's all good news. Now, if you're interested in statistics, Down at the bottom here, you can see that blue link highlighted. I've also posted it on the web. But that is the Johns Hopkins. I have been tracking that since probably the second week of the pandemic. They update their statistics all the time, and you can look at your region, you can look at your state, you can look at another country in the world and see, what their current status is, how many cases they have, how many deaths, etc. So kind of interesting. I was tracking Arizona because this is where I'm living, and our governor here was not very interested in prevention. So he actually signed a law that schools could not close. So even though the pandemic was raging, he said schools could not close. Children had to go to school and bring home COVID. Anyway, I digress. Just my little anyway. So getting back to the lecture, countries who and their deaths per 100,000 in population. Okay, so you can see Brazil, they have a very high mortality rate. So 300 people, a little over 300 people per 100,000 people have died. You can see that United States is next on that list. Isn't that ridiculous? Yes, being one of the most advanced healthcare countries in the world, we should not have that kind of a death rate. But anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, a lot of people have their own beliefs about viruses and vaccines, and sometimes it's hard to change their minds. All right, so the U.S. I didn't update this this slide. This is actually from summer, early July. In the United States, we've had 86 million confirmed cases. That's probably closer to 90 now. Deaths, we've had over 1 million. I'd say we're probably close to 1.5 million. And 221 people fully vaccinated. That's closer to, I think, to 300 million. And the percent of the population fully vaccinated is currently running at about 68%, which is not enough to get rid of the disease. You have to have probably 85 to 90% of the population vaccinated in order to prevent the disease from recurring. So not there. This is cases and deaths from Department of Health and Human Services. So just looking at timeline, you can see we had a huge peak right up here. We've had a couple of peaks as far as deaths, the death rate. So here's the first hiccup, if you will, on the top chart. It's not very tall, but you can see that's where the greatest number of deaths were. And that was right around January of 2021. And then we move into where we are now. And you can see at the end of the graph, it's still circulating, but the death rate is pretty low. So California had a total of a little over 9 million cases, about 92,000 deaths. And that's not deaths per 100,000. Sorry about that. That's, because that would mean there's very few people living, but no, 92,000 deaths we've had. About close to 80 million people have been vaccinated. 84% of the population has been vaccinated. So California is in decent shape. It would be better if we were closer to 95, but that's at least something better than the rest of the nation. All right, so here are case counts in different states. You can see Mississippi's up there at the top, Arizona's right there at the next to the top, and then we continue on down. So anyway, just a graphic to show how different states responded. So Arizona, 2 million cases, 30,000 cases, deaths per 100,000. This is where this one comes in, 424. So out of every 10,000 people who got it, 42 died, or out of every 1,000 people, 4 died. That's the way you look at that. All right, and here is actually the entire tracking of the pandemic again. You can see the little blurb in July 2020, and then it really takes off in January of 2021. That's when, all of those cases have been spread. And then it gets bad again in January of 2022, and that's when some of the new variants start coming out. And so there's several different variants circulating. The BA variant is much more infectious than the Alpha. Luckily it wasn't the reverse, because we would have had lots and lots more death if the Alpha was as extremely transmissible as the Omicron. So prevent it, get vaccinated, stay up to date on your COVID-19 vaccines. I've had 4, and that's, whenever a new one comes out, within a month, typically 2 weeks, I go down and I get another vaccine. It doesn't hurt. It's keeps you from getting sick, and you never know what the next variant might be. The next variant might be very lethal. So anyway, that's why I do it. And everyone greater than 2 years old should wear a well-fitting mask in public, where the community COVID level of transmission is high. Even if you are vaccinated, you should avoid poorly ventilated spaces and crowds. Wash your hands often, very often. And if soap and water aren't available, use that hand sanitizer. But again, hand washing is the very best. Now, with winter coming up, there's going to be a lot of colds, there's going to be a lot of flus, and currently there's RSV circulating. So scientists are very concerned about a trifecta, which means you could get all of those viruses at the same time, and that would not be good at all. So even though we are a little bit less risk, still wash your hands. If you don't want to wear a mask, at least wash your hands every time you come into the house. Try not to eat anything before you do, and keep some sanitizer in your car, just so when you pump your gas, squirt a little sanitizer on there. When you go to the grocery store and push the cart around, put some sanitizer on there, just to help prevent, even influenza and colds. I mean, none of them are really fun. So prevention, cover coughs and sneezes, and don't stick around where people are not. Clean the high-touch surfaces in your home regularly and after you have visitors. So if someone comes in and, they're sitting at your table eating dinner, just clean the table off well. If someone is sick and or has tested positive, disinfect frequently. Test to prevent the spread to others. That will tell you that you're sick, and then you can have a good excuse not to come to class. And you should use the same practices for any and all respiratory diseases. One other little tip I had, this was before we even had COVID around. I would carry a pen with me during the winter. And when I went to sign my dinner bill or my credit card or whatever, I would use my own pen, just because that pen has been in many, many other people's hands, and, the germs stick around. So anyway, it's just one simple little thing, maybe a little bit germophobic, I guess, but I don't like getting sick, so that's what I did. All right, so a final note, there are over 1.5 million unknown viruses. Many of them can infect humans, and many of them could cause the next pandemic. So we must be cautious and ever vigilant. I have attached on the module page a 60 minutes little blurb, which was on last night, so that would have been Sunday, October 30th, about a woman from UC Davis, or a team from UC Davis, who are looking at looking in Uganda, I believe it was, at bats and taking samples from bats, trying to learn what the next virus pandemic might be. So anyway, if you're interested, take a look. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.